Hola, buenos días a todos. Soy Rafa de Miguel, el corresponsal del país en Londres. Bienvenidos a esta primera conferencia internacional en defensa de las categorías femeninas. Cuando me sugirieron poder participar en esta conferencia y dar paso a algunos de los panelistas realmente interesantes, me pareció una oferta muy atractiva porque es un asunto que, a medida que ha ido pasando el tiempo aquí en mi corresponsalía, me ha llamado cada vez más la atención el enorme debate que existe en torno a un asunto que tiene muchas aristas y que es muy complicado de entender y sobre todo que provoca a veces demasiadas pasiones. Recuerdo que el anterior gobierno conservador, el gobierno de Theresa May, tenía preparada ya una ley que prácticamente reconocía la autodeterminación de género sin ningún tipo de cortapisa, y fue otro gobierno conservador, el gobierno de Boris Johnson, el que decidió meterlo en el cajón. La conclusión que saqué con eso, que ya me llamó mucho la atención, fue, en primer lugar, que es un debate al que los políticos intentan huir de él en todo momento porque les resulta bastante problemático, y en segundo lugar, que es un debate que provoca muchas buenas voluntades, muchas buenas intenciones, pero también creo que bastante desconocimiento en muchas cosas. El asunto lo fui siguiendo durante un tiempo, pero hubo dos cosas que me llamaron especialmente la atención. Uno fue los ataques que sufrió la autora de la gran saga de Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, cuando decidió intervenir en todo el debate respecto a sexo y género. Me llamó mucho la atención que una mujer tan respetada de repente fuera sometida a unos ataques tan virulentos. Y luego mi entrevista personal que tuve con la profesora Catherine Stock de la Universidad de Essex, a la que se le había ocurrido también cuestionar algunos de los aspectos de la autodeterminación de género, y amaneció un día en la universidad con un montón de pintadas en su contra, y prácticamente, aunque era una mujer fuerte y una mujer con conocimientos sólidos y una mujer bastante convencida de lo que pensaba y de lo que decía, acabó tirando la toalla porque fue una situación muy desagradable para ella. Ese tipo de situaciones me hicieron pensar que probablemente un debate que la mayoría de la población considera de algún modo marginal es un debate, sin embargo, muy importante, y un debate en el que todos tenemos la obligación de conocer qué está ocurriendo y, en la medida de lo posible, tener una opinión. Y además una opinión porque este debate, que puede parecer algo muy genérico, en realidad, cuando se abordan asuntos concretos, vemos la importancia que tiene. Un asunto fundamental es el objeto de esta conferencia, el deporte femenino, y la posibilidad de acabar con una competición justa en el deporte femenino, precisamente por esa voluntad quizás malentendida o quizás no bien elaborada de inclusión. Ese es prácticamente el debate que está ocurriendo en estos momentos. ¿Cuál debe ser la prioridad? ¿Una competencia justa, un juego limpio, o una inclusión que se pretende sin saber exactamente hasta dónde se quiere llegar? A mí me llamó mucho la atención, por ejemplo, hace pocos meses, cuando los principales organismos deportivos del Reino Unido intentaron dar una respuesta a este asunto, y la respuesta la voy a leer porque me parece que en su ambigüedad refleja perfectamente qué es lo que ocurre. Pedía a todas las federaciones que adoptaran métodos innovadores y creativos para asegurarse de que nadie queda fuera. Está muy bien, la frase es fantástica, está llena de buenas intenciones, pero no soluciona nada. Ese es el problema, que cuando se trata de asuntos muy concretos como el deporte femenino, la situación de las prisiones para mujeres, los vestuarios o los cuartos de baño compartidos por diferentes géneros, todo ese tipo de situaciones que son complejas, requieren soluciones prácticas y requieren sobre todo un debate real. Pero bueno, más allá de esta introducción, quiero dar paso a una persona que seguramente nos va a explicar mucho mejor que yo cómo se ha construido ese debate y cuál es la situación en el Reino Unido, que es Fiona McAnena. Ella, aparte de venir del mundo de la empresa y de ser una ejecutiva de mucha importancia, sobre todo se ha destacado en los últimos años por su labor al frente de la asociación Fair Play for Women, Juego Limpio para las Mujeres, una asociación que no solamente defiende la necesidad de establecer reglas claras en el deporte femenino y de evitar lo que está ocurriendo en estos momentos, sino que además ha sido capaz de llevar a través de esa asociación a los tribunales muchos asuntos importantes y conseguir victorias relevantes. Por ejemplo, la que consiguieron en el Tribunal Supremo del Reino Unido cuando se reconoció que el sexo como categoría legal debía ser incluido dentro del censo de la Oficina Nacional de Estadística, algo que las organizaciones que defienden la autodeterminación de género querían que desapareciera a toda costa. Es decir, son pequeñas batallas jurídicas, campos concretos en los que se está librando una batalla muy interesante que creo que todos debemos prestar atención. Así que, sin más, voy a darle la palabra a Fiona McAnena. Fiona, por favor, cuando quieras puedes introducir tu ponencia.
Bien, voy a hablar brevemente de quiénes somos en Fair Play for Women. Me voy a centrar en el deporte y cómo el Reino Unido se metió en este follón con el deporte, cuál ha sido nuestra campaña, qué es lo que hemos hecho en los últimos años y qué hemos aprendido, porque a lo mejor le puede servir de ayuda a otras personas. Empezamos en 2017, centrándonos en las cárceles. Y aquí tenemos a nuestra directora, Nicola Williams, en la televisión nacional. Y esta es Karen. Karen estaba en una cárcel para mujeres en el Reino Unido. Y después, al año siguiente, nos centramos con oponernos a la identificación de sexo en la legislación británica. Salieron miles de mujeres a la calle para decirle a todo el mundo qué es lo que estaba pasando, porque nadie sabía lo que estaba pasando y muchas personas siguen sin haberse enterado de lo que realmente está ocurriendo. Desde entonces hemos añadido nuevas áreas, hemos hecho muchísimo trabajo sobre el deporte, sobre los reportajes en los medios de comunicación, recopilación de datos. Hemos tratado de conseguir que haya una comunicación en los medios que sea justa e igualitaria. Todavía no lo hemos conseguido, no sé si en España no han tenido más éxito. Tuvimos también un pequeño éxito con el censo, incluso en Inglaterra y en Gales, pero hemos perdido la misma batalla en Escocia esta semana y vamos a tener el próximo miércoles, y esto lo acabamos de saber, vamos a tener nuestro recurso porque vamos a tener la apelación entonces, así que vamos a ver qué ocurre. Vamos a ver cómo se metió aquí el mundo del deporte, cómo llegó a este punto. Tenemos un grupo el grupo de consejos deportivos por la igualdad. Es un grupo que recibe dinero y que se lo transmite a todos los organismos que se ocupan del deporte. Reciben financiación pública y elaboran directrices que se aplican a prácticamente todas las disciplinas deportivas en el Reino Unido. Y luego en 2013 encargaron a un consultor en diversidad e inclusión que escribiese una serie de orientaciones acerca de cuáles deberían ser las reglas aplicables a los deportistas transgéneros. Hablaron con los grupos transgénero, pero no hablaron con nadie más desde esa consultoría y nadie se enteró siquiera de que estaba ocurriendo esa consulta. Y publicaron, a raíz de esto, desde este grupo, de este consejo, del grupo de los consejos deportivos, diciendo que las mujeres transexuales podían simplemente haber estado hormonadas y podían competir como si fueran mujeres, y se adoptó básicamente por todos los organismos deportivos del Reino Unido, sin mayor consulta, sin darle sin reflexionarlo más. Así que empezamos, como digo, fue en 2018, es cuando nos dimos cuenta, fuimos realmente conscientes de la amenaza que esto suponía para los derechos de las mujeres a raíz de esta cuestión de la ley de reconocimiento de género, de todo lo que había pasado en las cárceles. Y en el deporte nos dimos cuenta de que era alguien, que todo el mundo lo podía ver, que esto era algo que el sentido común te dice que no puede estar bien. Y dijimos, bueno, y entonces, pues muy bien, pero ¿y dónde está la equidad para las mujeres en todo esto? Hablamos con todas las personas que pudimos. Hablamos con los consejos de deporte, hablamos con los NGBs, que son los organismos de gobernanza nacionales. Voy a utilizar mucho este término, los NGBs, porque, por ejemplo, son equivalentes a las federaciones nacionales para Gales, Escocia, Inglaterra, Irlanda del Norte. También hablamos con las federaciones internacionales, con el COI cuando pudimos, preguntándoles, bueno, ¿y en dónde deja aquí todo esto a las mujeres? Y nos resultó muy difícil conseguir cobertura mediática y vosotras, la verdad es que lo habéis hecho muy bien hoy, porque a nosotros esto nos ha resultado dificilísimo.
Okay, in 2019, I joined the organization and we started a big push to look at all the policies that governing bodies had about this issue and to contact them all and say, this isn't fair, this isn't right. We got you can imagine, a rather poor response, because who were we to raise this issue? But we started going to women's sport conferences, so where people were celebrating women's sport, and we would ask awkward questions. What about fairness for females. How does transgender inclusion affect females? I can tell you, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees when we asked those questions. It was icy and very uncomfortable, but we kept doing it at every opportunity. We kept raising it. And we would find that sometimes people would quietly say to us, I agree, but they wouldn't say it in public. It's quite uncomfortable. I think things are improving. We pushed for media coverage. We didn't get much. Yeah, people felt like, and still in the UK, they really don't want to talk about it. We teamed up with Sharon Davis, the Olympic swimmer, British Olympic swimmer, and we got a letter signed by 60 Olympians, male and female, to the IOC. The IOC didn't even answer. So we had an event with Sharon, a bit like this, in summer 2019, and we got 700 people to that event. It was jointly, we ran the content and we did it with an organization called Women's Place UK. I'll show you. I hope. Yeah, like you, we had a prestigious venue. It was a big hall opposite the Houses of Parliament in London. Here's Nicola again, our director. Emma on the left, who unfortunately, as you know, isn't here today. Linda Blade, who is going to be with us. And we had to keep pushing. So as I say, we didn't get media coverage, but we knew there was support. A lot of people, women and men, agreed with us. And so we felt we had to be the public voice for women. So we kept pushing. We really made a nuisance of ourselves with the sports bodies, Sport England in particular. But we also got to participate in a World Athletics meeting where they were talking about transgender athletes. And again, Nicola, my colleague, was the only voice speaking for women. And again, it was very frosty. No one wanted to talk about it. But we kept going, as I will. We kept pushing for a review of that 2013 guidance to say, you didn't think about the effect on women. At the same time, they were consulting trans groups about changing rooms. And it was the usual thing, you know, trans people have to go where they want to go. And we forced our way into the meeting. And again, we were the only voice saying, hold on a minute, don't we have a right too to privacy? Finally, in February, so 2 years ago exactly, World Rugby woke up to this problem and had a big workshop, which you'll see. John, who you'll hear from in a minute, was there. Nicola was there. Emma was there. All the names were there. And finally, they had a proper consideration of the issue. And we were delighted. We thought this is the beginning of a big change. And indeed, the guidance that came out from World Rugby was really sensible. So World Rugby led, but nobody followed. We couldn't believe it. All the national federations for rugby in the UK said, they're bigots, we're not doing it, which was really shocking to us. But we didn't give up, we kept pushing. And we had a big breakthrough in March 2020 when the sports councils decided that they would review that 2013 guidance. And this time they do it properly. And they issued a tender and they appointed people who knew what they were doing, people with a sports medicine background. We were delighted. It took a very long time for that guidance to come out. I have no doubt it was very political. And while that was going on, we carried on lobbying and networking, collecting stories, trying to demonstrate that this was a big problem affecting a lot of women, not just a few trans women who needed to be, we needed to be kind to, but that actually there were women who were really being affected by this, women and girls. And we've also been looking for legal angles to show that policies are unlawful. That's difficult, but we keep going. So finally, in September last year, the guidance was published. So 18 months they were doing this work, but it's a very good piece of work. So I'm going to call it the SCEG guidance. John will talk about it too. So briefly, let me tell you that it was finally an opportunity for people to say what they thought. because remember that women were afraid to speak. They've published everything from this study, from this report on their website. So there's a website called equalityinsport.org. It's all there. It's a terrific piece of work. It's got the scientific evidence all reviewed. It's got the law in the UK. It's got the report from the interviews they did. Very comprehensive. The most striking thing, you think that sport policy is a sort of dry, quiet topic, but finally people were able to speak. And this is what the report says. It says there was a lot of swearing, shouting, crying, and anxiety. That people agreed to speak only if they could have anonymity because they were afraid. I mean, it's so shocking that that could be the case, but it is the case. I mean, you may know that. But have this in an official report is really valuable to us, because now we can say to the sports bodies, you do need to listen to us because your own athletes can't speak. And the report talks about how people were threatened with losing their place in the team, or they were afraid that, or losing their sponsorship, and so on. So briefly then, what the guidance actually does, it lays out 10 principles, and it's pure common sense, but they had to spend 18 months getting there to prove that it was the right thing. The most important thing is the principle that they conclude, which is no more balancing trans inclusion with fairness and safety for females. You cannot trade those off. And that's fundamental, because that's what the sports bodies keep talking about. It's what the IOC talks about. And John will talk some more about this. But for us in the UK, again, a moment of triumph. We thought, here we go. It's really clear. So we launched a new phase of work where we were saying to sports bodies, the guidance says that you must choose. Indeed, the guidance does say that. It says sports bodies have to choose between transgender inclusion or fairness and safety for females. You'd think that was an easy choice, wouldn't you? So we've been contacting all the sports bodies in the UK again, all the national governing bodies. I've no idea why that link is up there, but never mind. We've been seeking meetings with them. We've been talking to them. They don't all want to talk to us, but so far I've met with about a dozen and learned a lot. And I'm going to spend the last bit of my talk telling you about what they say, because I think it's really, really instructive. So they all say, well, sport must be trans inclusive. Well, we say, of course it must, but that doesn't mean the female category has to be trans inclusive. They say, but it's a human rights issue. We say, it's not a human rights issue to choose what category you go in. And what about the human rights of women too? They say, well, there are only a few trans women, so, you know, what's the big deal? That's a really terrible argument. There are so many, and I've written an article covering all of these issues and our answers to them. You will have your own answers, but I've explained all of that on our website. But the bottom line is, why would a few trans women matter more than a few other women? And besides, when you have one trans woman in a team or a club, it affects the whole team. Sometimes doesn't, you know, several women will withdraw because they don't want to share the changing room, or because it's not fair anymore, or because they feel it's unsafe. So, and it's a growing problem. So that's a really terrible argument, but it's a very common one. Some people say to us, well, trans women are women, so legally, of course, they're entitled. Well, that is not the case. It's not the case in the UK, at least. And we have to put them straight on that. Someone has said to me, well, but if I make a rule, these women, the trans women can't come in the women's category, I'm denying their identity. And we say, but sport is not about identities. It's not about gender identities. It's about your sex. It's about bodies. So you're saying nothing about their identity. That's not what sport is for. This is a big problem, because people are really afraid. They're really afraid to push back. Some people say, but the women in our sport welcome trans women. Well, this is where the SCEG report is helpful. We say, look, they can't say otherwise. They have no choice. And besides, that's not how you make rules in sport. You don't let the players all decide the rules. So as I say, I've covered these in an article. There are some more things they say. Some people really think that the differences between male and female performance are not very big, which is, yeah, but that's because they don't see it, because they honestly don't know. And again, John's going to talk more about that. It's a problem that people think it's sexist to say that men and women can't perform against men, but we don't have a problem with that. We need our own sports in order to have opportunities. We all know that. One of the things people try to do is say, well, okay, I agree with you. I realize it's a problem. So at the elite level, we'll fix it. But further down, can we just be inclusive? Which again is a really terrible argument, because if it's unfair at the top, it's unfair for everyone. Then they say, well, people can find their own level. The males, the trans women wouldn't be elite, but they'd be somewhere. And again, we say, well, that's an argument for mixed sport. If you think you should have mixed sport, by all means have it. But that's what and they say, well, no, we don't mean mixed sport. There have been some bodies, rugby being one, who said, well, we can't exclude, we don't want to be mean. We realize it's a problem. We won't exclude all trans women. We'll assess them on a case-by-case basis, which initially sounds appealing because it sounds kind and inclusive, and it's a disaster, because how can you decide who's in and who's out? So again, we say that's really discriminatory. You're going to choose which trans women are okay and which ones are not. Disaster. We know where that ends up. They're all in. And then finally, our chief medical officer has approved this policy, but our lawyer has signed it off. And again, we say, look, you don't let them make the policies, but you don't let them make the rules. It may be lawful to let trans women into women's sport, but it is also lawful to keep female sport for females. You have a choice. So like the SCEG guidance said, governing bodies must choose. So let me round up then by saying what we've learned and my tips that I can share. The first thing to say is assume nothing, because we meet people in sport who really don't know what they're doing. And they are doing their best, but in this area, they haven't properly thought about it at all. We find people who misunderstand the law. That's good. We can help them. We can put them right. We find people who misunderstand science. They really don't understand the gulf in performance between male and female physicality. And again, the SCEG report covers both of those things really well. And we can point to that. Don't take our word for it. Here is the Sports Council's equality group laying it all out for you. Here is the best scientific evidence. So that's really helpful to be able to point to that. We find people who think testosterone suppression must be a good solution. Why? Because the IOC did it. But now the IOC have walked away from it. And besides, the evidence is so clear it doesn't work. Again, this covers that. So we have to push and remind them that, no, that rule was adopted, but it's a bad rule and it doesn't work. We find people who feel guilty about excluding trans people, and we remind them that women will be excluded if they let people into the female category who are not female. And I actually had someone say to me the other day at the end of a meeting, she said, I don't feel guilty anymore. But most of all, I would say we find people who have barely thought about this at all. Years ago, they followed the SCEG guidance. They gave it to a diversity consultant or their inclusion officer who talked to the trans groups and came back with the rule. And everyone thought, tiny problem solved. So we do have to recognize that good people have made bad policies and we can help them make better policies. So find out what's driving them, because it may just be a lack of thought. So finally, my tips for talking to sports people. I recommend questions. Is your sport sex affected? Almost always the answer is yes. They run female sport and female competition and male competition. Okay, so should some males be allowed into the female category? Why? Well, that's a hard question for people to answer, but that's what they're doing. They start to see that's what they're doing. So then I say, why is that a good policy? Or why is that a necessary policy? And that's when you get the stuff about the law or the identity, or, well, it's only a few, and you can start to address those things. I have to remind people when they are feeling guilty or emotional, why not have the same empathy for women and girls? If you're feeling bad for the trans women, what about everyone else? You know, think about them too. And why don't we deserve fairness? You know, why is their feeling more important than our need for fairness? And that's a hard one for people to defend. And then finally, this is a really useful perspective, which people forget. Categories in sport have to exclude some people. That's how they work. That's how we make sure that there's a place for everyone. That's how we make sure everyone's included. Being inclusive in sport does not mean being inclusive in every category. That makes no sense. And I give examples of juniors or weight categories. You don't get to choose just because you identify as lighter than you are, or because you wear lighter yesterday. So, you know, people need our help to understand that it's not mean, it's not unkind, it's not wrong to exclude some people from the female category. And I recommend you remind them, finally, that we don't have a problem with trans people. That is not our concern. It's the male performance advantage. That's why we need a female category. So I think the tide is turning. I think it's a long fight, but I think we can win.
Thank you so much for a quite clarifying presentation that probably gives us a clue that this problem needs some much more reasoning and much less sentiment and viscerality. Muchas gracias, Fiona, por una presentación que creo que nos ha servido para entender que este debate solo empezará a cobrar sentido cuando se le introduzcan datos, racionalidad y muchos menos sentimientos y agravios. Y me piden además que dé paso ahora al profesor John Pike, uno de los que participó precisamente en el informe Juego Limpio, Biología, Justicia y Atletas Transgéneros en el Deporte Femenino. Él es profesor de Filosofía en la Open University y especializado además en Filosofía del Deporte y presidente de la Asociación Británica de la Filosofía del Deporte. Así que, profesor John Pike, si puede subir, por favor, al estrado para tu presentación.
I'm sorry that I'm not Emma Hilton. Emma is not well. I work with Emma on a number of issues around this topic. We co-authored a paper for a Canadian think tank, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and she does academic work in developmental biology and works with sports scientists. I'm a philosopher. My interest is in the ethics of sport. And this is, if you like, a multi-dimensional issue where science and sports science and developmental biology fits with thinking about fairness and ethics and justice and rights. And so the academic direction and focus comes from a whole different set of disciplines. So this is a presentation both by me and Emma. The first part is Emma, the second part is me. And I'm going to talk about these topics. I'm going to talk about sex. Sorry, let me go back. I'm going to talk about sex. I'm going to talk about sex and sport. I'm then going to say a little bit about testosterone and testosterone suppression. and then move on to the ethical aspects of it. Two aspects that came out of our work in the UK, one with World Rugby and the other with the sports councils. So I will talk about the proposal for, if you like, a reconceptualization of categories into female and open. So a protected female category and an open category. And I'll say something about the rationale of that. Sex. Okay, so sex is not simply, we are a dimorphic species, but we're not the only dimorphic species. You have there, so sex is a divide and a phenomenon that carries through species, and as Emma puts it, divides into big gametes and small gametes. And this is a fundamental and immutable feature of human life, but also of other species. And the best way in order to think this through is in terms of reproductive function. Now, this sets up a series of mechanisms in the human body that have multiple effects, thousands of effects in terms of physical characteristics. This is what makes sex important for sport. What we talk about is not male advantages, plural, but male advantage as a whole series of characteristics that flow from, that come from the mechanism of sexual reproductive function and lead to all these differences in physical differences, functional differences, and performance differences. Now, when you come into this, you might have a figure in your head of sort of 10 to 12% as the figure that gives male advantage over female advantage. Now, that in some respects is a very rough generalization. As you'll see, and this is work that Emma's done, this is a chart we published in the Canadian paper. If you come to some extremes, punch power, you're looking at 162% gap of male punch power over female punch power. And this is to do with upper muscle mass. So in sports such as cycling, running, you might be looking at 10, 12% as the gap, but in other sports, the gap's going to be much higher. How does this pan out? For female runners, there are thousands of males who are faster than the current 100-meter champion, Elaine Thompson-Herah. And the gap is both high and it kicks in early. So the 15-year-old, right, so the Flojo record, which is pretty much untouchable for women, is nonetheless beaten by the 15-year-old schoolboy record in the US. Now, something that people use in this argument is what Emma and I call the Phelps gambit. The idea that Michael Phelps has certain physical advantages, and this means that particular physical advantages in sport are not a huge problem. So therefore, what's the issue with trans women competing in women's sports? They've got, sure, maybe they've got physical advantages, but look, we allow the sorts of advantages that Michael Phelps has got. This is an indication of the quantitative difference between Phelps advantage and male advantage. Okay, so Phelps's advantage over the next closest swimmer is 0.08%. Phelps's advantage over the fastest female swimmer is 12.62%. It's simply not comparable. There are other reasons why the Phelps gambit doesn't work, kind of philosophical reasons, which we'll maybe come to. But quantitatively, the Phelps advantage argument is just lousy. And in terms of weightlifting, here you can see the effects of upper body strength and muscle strength on the differences between male and female weightlifters. So we've got the smallest male weightlifter at the top, the strongest female weightlifter at the bottom, smallest male weightlifter is lifting 3% more than the strongest, biggest female weightlifter. And you can see, of course, that the two lines just track up straightforwardly as you would expect from the dimorphic nature of the species. So this brings us to whether there is a way of eliminating that male advantage in order to make it fair that trans women compete with women. And the suggestion is that testosterone suppression removes that advantage. The importance of Emma Hilton's work and Tommy Lundberg's work is to have proven that this is not true. You've got two papers, one by Hilton and Lundberg, and another, you'll notice the author of this, the lead author of the second paper is Joanna Harper, who herself is a trans woman, who is, if you like, on the other side of this debate, but acknowledges through a systematic review of the same data that testosterone suppression does not remove male advantage. Joanna Harper has shifted the terrain of the argument, or is trying to shift the terrain of the argument by suggesting that we should not pursue absolute fairness. She says she wants to substitute meaningful competition for fairness. I'm going to say something, just very quickly, I'm going to say something about open and female, if I can find the slide. Now, the important thing to understand here is that we're not advocating for, if you like, a third category, a trans category. The open and female idea works like this. The problem, if you like, is asymmetrical. It's not balanced. There are not two sides in the sense that trans men competing in men's sport doesn't throw up the same fairness criteria or problems that we have with trans women competing in female sport. So there is no reason to close off the male category to people who want to compete in that category, except for some marginal concerns about safety in combat and collision sport. But there is a very good reason for closing off the female category that you'll all be familiar with. Now, if you have an open category, that does not require that people affirm or deny any particular gender identity that they might feel uncomfortable with. They don't have to assert that they are male, tick a male box, tick a female box in a way that they feel uncomfortable with. Right, so an open category, if you like, takes gender identity out of the equation. And that's why we have advocated for it, because gender identity is not relevant for sport. Just, right, I've got politics, and I compete in sport. When I compete in a sporting team, I don't want anyone to select me or reject me on the basis of my politics. Equally, no one should select or reject me on the basis of my gender identity, because it's not relevant to sporting competition. So the proposal is to take gender identity, not sex, but gender identity out of the equation and say we compete according to fair biological categories. And we're there. Those are the two current classes. And this is the proposal adopted by the Sports Quality. And our proposal is to change the 2 current classes to female and open. And I'm going to stop there. Okay, thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Pike, por esa presentación. Y teniendo como tenemos a 2 panelistas tan importantes, a mí me gustaría hacerles una pregunta a cualquiera de ellos, a Fiona o al profesor John Pike. Hemos escuchado las recomendaciones del Consejo Deportivo del Reino Unido y cómo las distintas federaciones pusieron muchas excusas para aplicarlas. Pero mi pregunta realmente es, ¿tienen ustedes alguna información sobre la opinión pública en el Reino Unido y en especial sobre el ámbito general de las mujeres en el Reino Unido? ¿Cuál es el sentimiento? ¿Cuál es la opinión de la mayoría de la ciudadanía respecto a este asunto? ¿O sigue siendo un asunto muy cerrado a ámbitos concretos?
We know that public opinion is on our side, but 2 things, Rafa. One is that the media barely mentions this topic, and when they do, it's usually a celebration of trans inclusion. And so people feel that their opinion is not acceptable. They feel that the decent thing to do is to be inclusive, as you heard me say. So we know that public opinion supports us. The other thing is that people don't understand how big the difference is. So some people think that testosterone suppression works. We never see male and female perform side by side. I sometimes send people a video that's on YouTube from the World Athletics Championships in 2019, when they had a mixed relay, 2 men, 2 women in each team, running 1 lap each, 400 meters. And because some teams put their athletes in a different order, in a different sequence, they ended up with men running against women. And you can see the difference is enormous. So people really don't understand that letting a few trans women with testosterone suppression into the female category is very, very unfair. Many people don't understand that. But if you ask them honestly, they don't really think it should be allowed to let males into the female category.
Professor Pike, you wanted to add something?
A couple of things. One is that World Rugby did a survey of their own players. I mean, there's a question about public opinion and there's a question about female athletes. And I think it's important to ask female athletes their view. The World Rugby survey got some responses from female rugby players who say, yes, I'm in favor of trans inclusion because testosterone suppression removes their advantage. So the view was a welcoming and inclusive one, but it was based on false science. And I think there's a real question of honesty here and integrity of sports organizational bodies. I appreciate that this is a struggle for women's rights, but it's also a crisis and a struggle for the integrity of sporting organizations. Because at the moment, the view that testosterone suppression removes male advantage, which is just false, is being used to prop up claims for trans inclusion into female sports. So I think this is a crisis for, if you like, integrity and ethics sport, quite like the anti-doping, the doping crisis. And the persistence of doping in professional and competitive sport. It's of a similar scale. The trouble is that this one isn't properly acknowledged. We don't have the World Anti-Doping Agency. We don't have organizations that are monitoring fair sport on the basis of sex. And we need something of that scale to resolve this difficulty. And we need to get the regulations right, and the regulations are terribly wrong.
Finalmente, me gustaría hacerle una pregunta a los dos. Me da la sensación de que este debate, con todo el rigor con que han expuesto sus posiciones, quieren circunscribirlo al ámbito racional y al ámbito de los datos y al ámbito de la biología. Y me da la sensación de que lo que tienen enfrente es sobre todo una batalla ideológica, que es bastante más complicada de solucionar que con el mero debate racional.
I sometimes remind people that you can't fight emotion with reason. So we can make all the rational arguments, the science and everything else, and prove that women need our own category. But the emotion of the poor trans people just replaces all that. So I agree with you. It is an ideological argument, and people, that's why it's important to remind people that women have human rights too, and that fairness is not only for some people, and that sport is not about feelings, it's about performance. You know, so and it's a reason why we're gathering stories of females being excluded or having to self-exclude because of someone else being included in their category. So we have our own emotion to counter theirs.
I think it's important to say, to respond basically to a lie. This is a lie, and it annoys me a good deal. And that is that we are in favor of excluding trans people from sport. That is false. It's always false. It's the line particularly pushed by the American Civil Liberties Union. And people tell them whenever they say this, that this is a move to exclude trans people from sport. Everyone in this hall knows that that's false. Everyone in this campaign, this movement, knows that it's just false. What we are, I have no problem with Quinn, the Canadian soccer player, of course, who is non-binary, describes themselves as trans, uses they, them pronouns. I have no problem with Quinn playing for the Canadian soccer team and winning gold, obviously. I have a problem with male-bodied athletes competing in female sport, and I think we should have a category, an open category, in which is welcoming for trans women, where they don't have to declare their gender identity, and that males, should shove up and make room for male-bodied athletes who identify in that way. So that's the first thing. It's just false that we are opposed, that we want to exclude trans people from sport. I've forgotten the second thing I was going to say. I'll stop there.
Well, can you hear me now? The organizer has told me that we have to move on. So Fiona and Professor Pike and Fiona McAnena, it's been wonderful to listening to your arguments and your explanations, and we really appreciate you being here in this conference, and thank you very much. I think we can, I can ask everyone for an applause for you. Pido a todo el mundo un aplauso para los dos ponentes que creo que han hecho una presentación extraordinaria y llena de datos y muy interesante.
En nombre de la Fundación Mujeres, quiero saludar a todas las mujeres deportistas y a las participantes en esta primera conferencia internacional en defensa del deporte femenino. Las mujeres hemos recorrido un largo camino, cuajado de obstáculos, y hemos conquistado muchos espacios. La práctica deportiva es uno de ellos. Y tenemos que seguir abriendo espacios. Tenemos que dejar que las niñas sueñen con tener grandes triunfos en su práctica deportiva. Pero el deporte ha de ser juego limpio. Y ahora que surgen obstáculos nuevos, tenemos que manifestarnos con toda claridad. No vamos a dejar que nos borren. No vamos a permitir que nos hagan trampas para ganarnos.